Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 103. In our most recent lecture, we examined the modern civil rights movements. We included feminism as part of that overview of the modern civil rights movements. But here in this lecture, I want to take a more focused and deeper look at the modern feminist movements to help broaden your understanding of this key element of post-World War II American history. Now, when we use the term feminism, it is often this period, the 1960s and the 1970s, that we think of. But we've always had feminism in American history, from the colonial period through the Revolutionary era and debates when the Constitution was being written as to whether or not the rights associated with that document applied to women too. So feminism is at our origins in the early 19th century. You have a wave of feminism amidst the reform efforts of that period. Feminists were often abolitionists seeking to abolish slavery, and with it, they became themselves advocates for the emancipation of women. Then in the Civil War, you have the sacrifice and service performed by women that would really buoy their efforts after the Civil War in the late 19th century in the cause of suffrage and other political reforms and rights. And then you have the 19th Amendment, 1920, which allowed at least white women to vote. So American history is filled with feminism. There's nothing more American than feminism. Unfortunately, when we often use the term, we think of the more contemporary period, 1960s, 1970s. But that's one beat in a longer rhythm. Feminism doesn't just erupt out of nowhere in the 1960s and 1970s. It's part of a long history. Now, the modern feminist movements that are our focus here today begin in the post-World War II period after the changes that World War II brought to American women. The image we have here of Rosie the Riveter, famous iconic image of World War II, is very accurate because in World War II, women did have new opportunities, particularly associated with employment. World War II, millions of men and women went and fought the war. Women did not serve in combat, but they were right there on the front lines, aiding soldiers, sailors, and Marines. You had a massive exodus of men and women during World War II to prosecute that war, fought in 3 different theaters around the globe. And that meant you needed everybody on the factory floor making the planes, tanks, and jeeps that were also vital and necessary for the war. So during World War II, women had new opportunities to work, and in doing so, have greater command over their economic opportunities and liberty. They could earn wages, and in doing so, imagine themselves as economically independent. They advertised the fictions of sexism. In World War II, women were right there on the factory floor, right alongside men, picking up big sheets of steel, carrying it to the other side of the factory and riveting it to another sheet of steel. They were doing heavy labor. They were doing the sort of work that your wussy history professor has no interest in doing. I mean, look what I do for a living. I yell at people about things that happened hundreds of years ago. I don't carry things. I don't get my hands dirty. Hell no, right? But in World War II, women did carry things. They did get their hands dirty, and they were doing labor that had long been imagined to be men's work. And instead, they proved that anyone could do this. Women can do anything. So in World War II, women worked. They worked on the factory floor. Their labor was valuable. Their labor was in demand. As a result, they could earn wages, imagine themselves economically independent. They did not have to get married and be dependent on their husbands. They did heavy labor. They advertised the fictions and falsehoods of sexism, demonstrating that women could do anything. But after World War II, in the late 40s and 1950s, in that early containment period, they were told to get married, move off to the suburbs, forego a career, forego an education, and dedicate all of their energies and attentions to raising a family. Containment is a very good way of understanding the 1950s. It is America's foreign policy in that period, in the ways that we described in many lectures earlier in the class. But of course, it also applies to racial minorities who are expected to get back in their place, accept second-class status in Jim Crow America. Later in the class, when we talk about the efforts of sexual minorities, gays and lesbians, they too were subject to repression in the containment era. In the case of feminism, our focus here, women were told in the 1950s, amidst the containment era, that they should contain their energies and ambitions. They should forego a career and education. They should forget about the opportunities and liberties that they experienced in World War II and instead best serve the nation by getting married, moving off to the suburbs, and dedicating their lives to being wives and mothers. This is very much related to the Cold War containment philosophy, because women were told in the 1950s the best way they could serve their nation, the best way they could serve in this Cold War effort against the threat of international communism was to inculcate in their children good patriotic values, good health, so they would be vigorous and able to fight in the wars America would have to fight to defeat communism. So this was couched often as service for women, that they were serving the country by being good wives and mothers. Of course, that meant they had to forego a career, forego an education, forego a life of their own making, instead follow the script. In the 1950s, young girls were steered towards home ec and away from shop classes in high school. Certainly the dominant media image was of women as wives and homemakers. And so wherever you looked in America in the 1950s, young women were encouraged to contain their energies and ambitions for a life of their own making, an unorthodox life, a career and education, and instead focus on this way of serving the nation as wives and mothers. They should get married, move off to the suburbs, and dedicate their lives to scrubbing floors and wiping poopy butts. But then here comes the 60s. Here comes civil rights. Here comes the efforts of racial minorities who are in the streets, who are protesting, who are staging sit-ins, who are raising awareness and consciousness of how they are second-class citizens, denied freedom, opportunity, education, a career. And that inspired in many ways the modern feminist movement. There's a real important overlap in American history between feminism and the cause of racial justice. I mentioned earlier that in the first wave of feminism, many abolitionists began their career dedicated to abolishing slavery. But when they voiced the argument for abolishing slavery, that enslaved people are human beings who deserve to be rewarded for their labor, who deserve a chance to be in charge of their lives, who deserve a chance at education, when those words left their mouths, these abolitionists said, hey, that applies to us too. The very language of abolitionism inspired feminism because at the core, the common denominator here of these two intertwined developments is human equality, human dignity, human opportunity. Flash forward here into the post-World War II period, and again there's this overlap between racial justice, racial equality, and gender equality. Because as civil rights was blossoming, as the nation was experiencing that second Reconstruction, that great racial reckoning, when racial minorities are in the streets demanding opportunity, American women hear in their argument something that applies to them. They too were denied freedom, opportunity, careers, education, a life of their own making. They too were subject to power and authority imposed upon them. Now, of course, it's important to note that the experience of a white woman in 1950s America is very different than the experience of an Asian American or African American citizen. But there are, again, ways in which the crusade for civil rights, with its message of liberty, opportunity, freedom, could inspire women to be more aware of how they too were denied freedom and opportunity. So that's another way in which we could see the overlap between our discussions earlier about race and civil rights in a way that can help us understand the modern feminist movement as about civil rights. Feminism is about civil rights. It's about opportunity. It's about being recognized as full, equal members of this nation who should be able to pursue all that's associated with that citizenship and status. The key event in the origins of the modern feminist movement. Again, we've always had feminism. Feminism is a constant in American history. But a key event of the modern feminist movement came in 1963. Now, in the early 1960s, we still had that containment philosophy in regards to gender, that men were expected to be breadwinners, pursue a career and education, and women were expected to get married, move off to the suburbs, stare at the TV, and be homemakers. But in that context, in 1963, a book was published that would urge women to, again, be more aware of the limits imposed upon them from such a gender ideology. 1963 is a fascinating year. Hopefully you can see that at this point. It's the year of the March on Washington. It's the year of Kennedy's assassination. And it's the year of the publication of The Feminine Mystique, written by Betty Friedan. And this book is widely recognized as the catalyst, the beginning of the modern feminist movement, the push against the repressive 1950s gender ideologies. In this book, Betty Friedan describes the problem with no name. And it's a problem with no name because no one's ever identified it as a problem, seen it as a problem, just instead understood it to be the way things are. What was this problem with no name? Well, Betty Friedan did aspire to a career. She wanted to be a journalist, but she quickly realized that she would never be able to rise to the status and prominence in that field of journalism because, as a woman, she was expected to do work, labor, that men were excused from. She describes how, after a long day working in journalism, writing, editing, researching, she was expected to come home for her second shift, where she was expected to cook, clean, care for the children, while her husband sat on his ass and drank a martini. The idea here was that men can pursue their ambitions. Men can rise to prominence in their respective fields because they can dedicate all of their energy, all of their focus to their career, because they're not expected to cook, clean, and care for children. And for Friedan, that's why men are in institutions of power, because they've successfully prevented themselves from competing with half of the population, confining women to, again, the roles as homemakers. Women would never be able, Friedan argued, to dedicate their full focus and attention to their career because they're expected to do all of these other tasks that men are excused from. Friedan realized that she would never be able to contribute in her role as journalist, and for this she saw as very stifling, limiting, denying freedom, opportunity, and benefits, social benefits that will come from emancipating women and allowing them to pursue, like men, a career, an education, a life of their own making. So this was the problem with no name. Betty Friedan was very critical of a 1950s America that urged women to get married, move off to the suburbs, and see that as an ideal, the best way of living, the good life at hand. Instead, she referred to an icon of 1950s America, an icon of that American dream, the suburban home, as, quote, a comfortable concentration camp. And this is her argument, that we have confined 50% of the population, denied them an opportunity to contribute to society. Not only would the emancipation of women allow women to pursue a life of their own making, a career, an education, but we would all benefit if talented individuals weren't home wiping poopy butts and staring at the TV and trying to convince themselves that this is the good life, this is what we all want. For her, the suburban home, that icon of 1950s America, which was celebrated as a vision of the good life, which was identified as the locus of freedom in the kitchen debate, where Richard Nixon pointed at a kitchen and said, there, that's freedom. For Betty Friedan, that's where the dreams, the aspirations of millions of American women go to die. Comfortable concentration camp, a pretty remarkable and provocative term in the aftermath of World War II, where there actually were concentration camps in this country, and of course in the aftermath of the revelations of the Holocaust. For Betty Friedan, the suburban home is not where you aspire to be, it's where you hope to flee. It's a concentration camp where we've concentrated half of the population, where we lure people in this idea that it's comfort and pleasure, the good life, and ultimately it's empty stifling, and denies people freedom, opportunity, and the chance to contribute to society. This book became a huge bestseller. It became the focus of a great deal of argument and debate. American women avidly read this book and then flooded Betty Friedan with letters saying, your problem is my problem. I too wanted a career. I too was told to get married, move off to the suburbs. I too was steered away from my interest in science and math and told to learn home ec. And that's when Betty Friedan realized that she had tapped into a larger sentiment, that her problem was a larger problem. She struggled after the publication of The Feminine Mystique to find work. It's kind of strange, ironic, that this woman who had published this book of great renown, that had sparked a larger cultural debate, that was a huge bestseller, would struggle to find work. Problem for Betty Friedan was that every time she went looking for a job in journalism, at a magazine or newspaper, invariably the person who was in charge of that newspaper or magazine was a man. And he may not have read The Feminine Mystique, but he knew its core argument. The core argument was the only reason why you're in charge, the only reason why you run this newspaper is because you're scared to compete with us. As a result, Betty Friedan had to make her own way in the world. She helped found NOW, the National Organization for Women, that helped to set the agenda of the modern feminist movement. NOW called for the emancipation of women so they could pursue an education, a career, jobs, to be equal autonomous individuals to men. It called for women to be more active in politics, to vote, to help women of color secure the right to vote, to run for office, to reform institutions that were male-dominated and create a more equitable America. So again, there are many, many parallels here between the cause of civil rights and the cause of feminism, how feminism is about civil rights. Betty Friedan wanted, in many ways, the same goals, aspirations that motivated African Americans and Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans. Jobs, 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 education. That's what makes you truly autonomous, free, able to pursue a life of your own making. Greater political participation, greater political voice. Vote and they can't ignore you. Vote and you can change the agenda. Run for office and change the institutions. So many of the goals that we talked about for racial minorities are here for American women. Now, also is very critical of other institutions in the cultural and social realm. Now was very critical of the beauty culture, which was dominated by men, cosmetic companies, Madison Avenue advertising, that seemed to proffer a very limited vision of beauty, a very limited vision of women's worth, that they were to be measured solely by their looks or their attraction to men. Very critical of how women were represented in media and popular culture, almost always as housewives, mothers. If they were represented as single women, they were represented as threatening, menacing, troubling. Film noir is a popular cycle of crime dramas in the late 40s, 1950s, and from it came an icon of such films, the femme fatale. In movies like that, the single woman, unattached woman, was always dangerous, always the force that led to your ruin and demise. And so the only image of women that's positive is when they're wives and mothers. Any image of them as single, independent-minded was always condemnatory. It's an example of how NOW argued that women are framed and represented in ways that seems to only offer the image of wives and mothers as acceptable. So NOW also critiqued the institutions beyond politics in our society and culture, which also seem to limit opportunities for women, how women would be perceived, and so NOW became vital to setting the agenda and template for the modern feminist movement. Betty Friedan publishes in 1963 The Feminine Mystique, sets in motion in many ways this modern feminist movement, creates a vocabulary, a set of arguments, a rebuke, most interestingly, a rebuke of a 1950s America that was celebrated as an ideal. She argues that if women were free to pursue a career education, they would be CEOs of corporations. They would be on the faculty of prestigious universities, and that's what made Betty Friedan very prescient, because today women are CEOs of corporations. Women are on the faculty of prestigious universities. Women are in institutions of power. Today, the majority of bachelor's degrees are awarded to women. Women are often out earning their husbands and the breadwinners in American families. Today, we have best-selling books with titles like The End of Men. Are men necessary? Because women are figuring out, look, I earn more money than he does. He doesn't help out around the house. He just sits on the couch playing Xbox, farting into the cushions. I don't need that in my life. So the American labor force is going to change a great deal in the next 10 to 20 years, because today the majority of bachelor's degrees are awarded to women. Women are excelling in the new economy, service sector economy. Betty Friedan anticipated that if women were liberated, if they weren't saddled with these demands that men are excused from, they would thrive and be more prominent in institutions of power. Another parallel between the modern feminist movement and the efforts of racial minorities in the civil rights era is that the modern feminist movement would advance an agenda of legislative change, laws change. That was a big part of what we strive to understand in the look at civil rights, that laws change. Well, women in the modern feminist movement sought to change laws in a way that opened opportunities for them. In 1963, that year where it seems like so much is happening, Congress passed and President Kennedy signed into law the Equal Pay Act, which barred discrimination among men and women who hold the same job. That if a man and a woman hold the same job, you can't pay the woman less than the man. This is very common prior to 1963, and in many cases in a sort of de facto way after 1963. That if you had two workers in your employ and they were doing the same job and they had roughly the same experience and background, an employer would pay the male employee more because, well, he's a breadwinner. He's got to take care of his kids. He has responsibilities. Like, they couldn't imagine those responsibilities applicable to women. Equal Pay Act was designed to remedy that, saying if you have two people in your employ who have the same skills, same background, same education, they're doing the exact same job, you can't just arbitrarily pay men more because you imagine that that's the role for men as breadwinners. Now, we now know that this is an ongoing effort to actually implement, because there's all sorts of ways employers get around this by making arguments that, well, he had 2 more years of experience here or whatever. We know that still women are paid less than men for the same work. And of course, there's also the issue of childcare, where quite often women are still saddled with many of those responsibilities, and that limits their education and employment trajectories and development, so that they get less pay than men who, again, never have to stay home and wipe poopy butts. The Equal Pay Act has been aspirational. It's been an effort, and it's an effort that continues to this day. When we talked about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I talked a lot about how it became more radical than it was originally formulated to be when it was first proposed. Southern senators and congressmen added to the Civil Rights Act a demand of gender equality, banning discrimination based on sex as well as race. Now, this wasn't because these Southern congressmen and senators all of a sudden became feminists. No, they again were trying to add something to the bill that would sabotage the bill, which would mean that certain congressmen and senators who did support the bill, when it was focused only on racial equality, say, oh, well, I'm not going to vote for that now, right? But it passed anyways. Civil Rights Act of 1964 is key, certainly, to ending Jim Crow and opening up opportunities for racial minorities, but it's also a key artifact of the modern feminist movement, because it bans discrimination based on sex as well as race. And from this would come all sorts of efforts to, again, enforce equality in the institutions and employment and unions that were key to racial minorities. in that effort towards equality. Now the equality that the Civil Rights Act mandated would apply to women too. And right now this is at the heart of a lot of issues regarding transgender discrimination and cases that are before the Supreme Court, and how the Civil Rights Act is supposed to be understood and interpreted. So again, like a lot of what we're talking about in this class, the changes that we see in this period continue to have resonance and applicability today. Civil Rights Act created the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was sort of the enforcement arm of this, to make sure that employers were abiding by the strictures of the Civil Rights Act. As we learned in those lectures on civil rights, one thing to pass a law, it's quite another to actually see it enforced. Resistance, blowback. Federal government has to come in and force states and individuals to do what they're not inclined to do. That's true in regards to race. It's also true in regards to gender. You can't just pass a Civil Rights Act and expect people to abide by it. It has to be enforced. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 created an enforcement arm, an entire arm of the federal government whose job is to hear complaints, grievances, investigate them, and make sure that employers are abiding by the Civil Rights Act. Remember, the Civil Rights Act applies to private businesses. And we're talking now about how that's true in regards to gender equality. So in the early to mid-60s, you could see a number of key legislative reforms that open up the door to greater gender equality in America. Legislative change, change in laws. What happens, though, in the late 60s, in regards to feminism, after these laws are passed, is that the focus changes to things that haven't been remedied yet, things that are often more so informal or part of society and culture. And that's very similar, another parallel here, to what we saw in regards to race. In the early 60s, we get the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and then in the late 60s, the focus of Dr. King and others turned towards jobs, education, issues of police brutality, things that hadn't been remedied. Dr. King is killed when he's formulating the Poor People's Campaign. He was advocating for a second New Deal that would employ people in public works projects. So in regards to race, you have the legislative achievements of the early to mid-60s, and then you have a shift to build upon them and address what had yet to be remedied. Well, you have a very similar pattern in regards to feminism in the same exact period, where in the late 60s, there was an effort to urge women to build on these legislative achievements and transform broader elements of society. College campuses would often feature consciousness-raising sessions where American women would get together in an effort to build solidarity, a grassroots movement, and, as the name indicates, make American women more aware of the way in which they were subject to discrimination, because a lot of discrimination is just woven into language, daily life, child rearing, the way you were raised. And so these consciousness-raising groups were again designed to expand the potential of change in this period, beyond just laws, beyond just what had yet been achieved, to change attitudes, to change cultural institutions, to make people committed to a broader feminist movement. And so in the late 60s and early 70s, feminism is changing in a couple of key ways. One, the agenda is changing, where now the focus is on what had yet to be remedied, elements of American life that were more difficult to change in culture, society, images in media, images in popular culture, gender and sexuality, attitudes about sex and female pleasure. Later in the class, it's coming, I promise, we'll have a lecture on the changes in this period in regards to sex, pornography, sexual revolution, and the more libertine values that prevail in this period. And a lot of that was tinged and inflected by feminist concerns, where women were encouraged to be sexual beings and pursue a libido, sexual pleasure, to enjoy pornography as part of that liberation. And that was part of what's changing here in the late 60s, early 70s in feminism, where the goal isn't voting rights and access to a union or even a college degree. It's more about, again, societal issues, cultural issues, gender, sexuality, media culture, how we educate sons and daughters. So a broader critique, more focused on less tangible but still important elements of American life. And then the other thing that happens in the late 60s, early 70s is that a new group of feminists develop, the heiresses to Betty Friedan and early pioneers, younger feminists on college campuses who are pursuing often a more radical agenda than their predecessors, who are more focused on institutions, laws, institutional change, employment. For younger feminists, questions like access to an abortion, birth control, sexuality, the war in Vietnam. There were many other issues that had yet to be addressed, and so that too played a role in this broader critique of American society and culture, advanced by younger feminists in the late 60s and early 70s. Here are a couple images to help us understand the point I'm making here about how in the late 60s and early 70s, the focus of the feminist movement was changing to cultural and social institutions after the legislative change of the early 60s. On the left, wearing number 261, is Catherine Switzer in the 1967 Boston Marathon. Now, talk about an American institution, Boston Marathon, well-known annual event. In 1967, Catherine Switzer was determined to enter the Boston Marathon and race alongside men. But in 1967, women were banned from racing in the Boston Marathon alongside men. Now, I don't know why anyone would want to run a marathon. I have a dog, and that obliges me to wake up early every day to walk the dog, because if I don't, he will shit on the carpet. That's my choice, either wake up early or shit on the carpet. So I choose wake up early. And when I'm out early in the morning, walking my dog to again avoid shit on the carpet, there are these other people who are also awake at a very early time without dogs, where shit on the carpet doesn't seem to be an issue for them, and they're running. They're just out there running at 6 o'clock in the morning. No one's chasing them. They're just running for the sake of running. I don't understand this behavior. It's very bizarre. I don't know why anyone wants to run, let alone a marathon. And I have no idea why we would ban women from running in the Boston Marathon. Catherine Switzer wanted to smash that glass ceiling. And so in 1967, she strapped on this number 261 and ran. In this image, you could see one asshole named Jock Semple trying to tackle her, prevent her from running in a marathon. Again, I don't know why anyone would want to run, but for Jock Semple, he couldn't accept this. These other men are trying to stop him from hurting Catherine Switzer and prevent her from running. So in 1967, another fateful year in the cause of civil rights, Catherine Switzer was trying to open up an institution of renown in American life, the Boston Marathon, by running in this marathon. She later helped to lay the groundwork for efforts to establish opportunities for women to run in marathon. In the early 70s, she won the New York City Marathon. 50 years after this incident, in this image here, in 2017, Catherine Switzer once again ran the Boston Marathon. She also that year ran the New York Marathon. She's still alive. I think she's in her 70s now. She's still an advocate for women's running. She has a global advocacy group that helps girls around the world embrace their athleticism. She's a remarkable person, still alive and still running marathons. And this incident in 1967 is a key flashpoint event that raised a lot of attention in regards to, again, how institutions in American life continue to discriminate against women, this institution being the Boston Marathon. On the right, another key incident in the feminist movement of the late 60s, early 70s. This is a protest that was staged at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, New Jersey. You could see the boardwalk in the background. And feminists were there protesting the Miss America pageant because the Miss American pageant was indicative of, again, a beauty culture that seems to reduce women to sex objects, tell young women their only worth is in their appearance. In the Miss America pageant, literally, women put on bathing suits and high heels, because that's always what you wear when you're wearing a bathing suit, right? High heels. Put a number on them, and then walk in front of men who will grade them. Yeah, if you think about what a beauty pageant is, it's very degrading. It's, again, putting women as specimens, as meat, really on display for men's titillation. And so that's why these women were protesting. And so they protest outside the Miss America pageant, again, an institution, a major part of American life, hoping to raise awareness of how women remained. Women could vote, women could attend a university, but women still were subject to a lot of these cultural and social institutions that limited women and reduced them to sex objects that parade in front of men and are awarded numbers based on how they look. So they're protesting that. And as part of that, they were going to throw in the trash symbols of women's oppression. Things from the beauty industry and culture that, again, reduced women to sex objects. This included girdles and bras. Now, originally, they planned to, after throwing all of these articles into the trash can, burn them as one last emphatic point of protest. But the day that they were staging this protest is pretty windy. They're on the beach there in Atlantic City. It gets windy by the beach. And the boardwalk is made of wood. So they said, you know what, it's probably not a good idea to set a fire. However, this event later would be misremembered, misinterpreted as one in which feminists burned their bras. And in the 1970s, a pejorative, an insult, a way of insulting feminists and reducing their cause was to call them bra burners. It's very common. Watch a sitcom watch All in the Family. Their great classic of the culture wars of the 70s, where cranky conservative Archie Bunker decries feminism by saying, "Oh, you bunch of bra burners," right? Well, that's a huge problem for a number of reasons. One, they never burned their bras. It never happened. They didn't burn them. And two, of course, it's also problematic because it reduces a movement, an ambitious movement about human dignity and equality, to a punchline. It's like calling someone an SJW today. If you're concerned about racism, if you're concerned about discrimination, well, I'll just call you a name, and then therefore you have, no agency, and it reduces the larger ambitions of your movement to, again, an internet punchline. Well, it's very similar here with bra burner. Note the name, Freedom Trash Can. Now, I talked a lot about how the Freedom Riders didn't call themselves the Voting Brigade. They didn't call themselves the Let's Register People to Vote. They called themselves the Freedom Riders because what was at stake was freedom. The protest against the Miss America pageant wasn't against that pageant. Certainly it was in the way in which it was degrading, but there was a larger ideal here. Freedom. That such institutions, a Boston Marathon that discriminates against women, a Miss America pageant that puts a crown on your head because you look good in a bathing suit and high heels, those are threats to freedom because they limit freedom, they limit opportunity, they reduce the ways in which women can be free, autonomous individuals in a more free, just, and equitable society. The other landmark work of the modern feminist movement is Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, second only to The Feminine Mystique in its importance and impact. This book, published in 1970, also speaks to the changes in the feminist movement by 1970, branching out to these issues of culture, society, a larger ken of possibilities. Millett argues in this book that all of American life is designed to keep women below men. She said the political system was designed by men to keep women below men. The founding fathers were all fathers. They were all men. And they drafted a constitution that effectively cut off political power for women. We didn't have a democracy. We had patriarchy. She argues in this book that the American economic system of capitalism was designed to keep women below men by concentrating wealth and capital in the hands of men only. Well, that was a rather provocative argument in 1970 when we were still in the throes of the Cold War and told that capitalism makes you free. Millett said, no, look at American history. It's confined and limited half of the population. She argues in this book that the dominant American religion of Protestant Christianity also has been used to keep women below men. The Bible is often used to urge women to accept a subordinate status with its admonitions to cleave to your husband, cleave to your father. So Millett pulled no punches. Millett offered this ranging, full-scale indictment of American life in 1970 after the achievements that we enunciated earlier. She said, everything in American life is designed to keep women below men, and as the title indicates, even sex, even the sexual act itself, according to Millett, it's political. Even the sexual act itself is about women below men. Millett argues in this book that when men have sex with a woman, they are telling that woman, I'm in charge, I'm on top. She said that the sexual act itself, coitus, is about men on top, men in charge. I know she wasn't thinking of all the kinky ways you guys are doing it. But that missionary position, that's about male dominance. Millett also argues in this book that the only reason why women think they want to have sex with a man is because they've been told that by a man. This is what you want. You'll like this. This will be great, right? Millett argues men are up there banging away hoping for what's best. But women, they know how to work the equipment because they have access to it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So in this book, she said to American women, if you really want to have a good orgasm, if you really want to have a good time, get together with other women. Again, this is indicative of the shift in feminism, how women were broadening the agenda here to address issues of gender, ideologies, societal images, institutions that had yet to be transformed and remedied, conditions of family life, sharing housework, standards of beauty, a beauty culture that continued to perpetuate this idea that women's only value was in their sex appeal to men. We'll talk later again in the class about how this is the time of the sexual revolution and more libertine values developing, and women were encouraged to embrace their libido, their sexuality, say they had a right to enjoy sex, express their sexual selves, pursue an orgasm. And so the feminist movement was changing in this period. With it came a demand for access to birth control. In the 1960s, as part of the rights revolution in this period, you had the Griswold v. Connecticut ruling that decriminalized birth control. Believe it or not, well into the 1960s, there were many states that made it a crime to sell or procure birth control. That effort of feminism was about deciding when and if one will become a mother. Also with this came the crusade for abortion rights. Prior to Roe v. Wade in 1973, 47 of 50 states had laws that limited access to an abortion. Women argued for the right to decide regarding their bodies, regarding sex and reproduction. By the late 60s and early 70s, feminism, which had begun from intellectuals like Betty Friedan, was now increasingly mainstream, with more and more women identifying themselves as feminists, embracing that. And the possibilities of liberation associated with that term. In a public opinion poll conducted in 1962, about 2/3 of women said, I've never been discriminated against. By 1974, the numbers had flipped, and 2/3 said, hell yeah, I've been discriminated against. Is that because all of a sudden, between 1962 and 1974, all of a sudden women are starting to be discriminated against? No. It's because women became more aware of how they had been subject to discrimination that they were never clued into to see as discriminatory. How they were, again, from their childhood, encouraged to define themselves as potential wives and mothers. How they contained their aspirations. Now they began to think much more critically about everything around them. Images and media and pop culture. Think about how they were raised and how they would raise their children, their rights regarding their bodies and their pursuit of sexual pleasure. But as feminism became more mainstream and as the critique broadened, there ultimately was a backlash. And this is the final way that, again, we can weave the feminist movement that is our focus here today with the civil rights efforts that we described in our very first lectures on civil rights and citizenship. By the 1970s, there was a backlash against civil rights as the nation shifted in a very conservative direction, as the Warren Court was replaced by the Burger Court. Something very similar happens in regards to feminism. As feminism was really building and becoming increasingly mainstream, there's a backlash to it. And part of the backlash is, again, cultural, social, denigrating feminists as bra burners. But that backlash would also, like the backlash against civil rights, manifest in institutions of power. And the best way to see that is in the equal rights debate of the 1970s. Now, some of you might be keenly aware of this thanks to a TV show that's aired recently about the ERA debate, focus on Phyllis Schlafly. I think it's called either Miss America or Mrs. America. I think it's Mrs. America. And so if you watch those shows on FX, you might be aware of this. That miniseries or series of episodes has Betty Friedan, played by Tracy Ullman, which sounds tantalizing. If you like Tracy Ullman, what a great role for her. I haven't seen them yet, obviously, but maybe over my quarantine summer, I'll put that on my streaming to-do list. So if you haven't watched the show, you're encouraged to do so. I hear good things about it, though there are the usual historical inaccuracies, but it sort of captures the clash between Phyllis Schlafly, the conservative, and the feminists advancing an equal rights amendment, which was first proposed in the 1920s by feminists in that era who wanted to build on the success of the 19th Amendment. In 1920, the 19th Amendment is ratified, forbidding discrimination in voting rights in regards to sex. It's often seen as the amendment that allows women to vote. Not true. It allowed white women to vote because all people of color, male or female, continue to be subject to discrimination in terms of voting rights. But 19th Amendment landmark achievement in ending discrimination, at least formally in regards to sex. And feminists in that era hoped to build on that and pass an equal rights amendment that, if passed, would end all forms of legal discrimination based on sex. It would do what eventually was done in the Civil Rights Act, but on a constitutional level. Civil Rights Act is an act of legislation. It's passed by Congress, and therefore it can be overturned, it can be undermined, it could be replaced. Constitutional amendments are the most solid forms of political change in America because they're hard to reverse. In order to change a constitutional amendment, you need another constitutional amendment. So the Equal Rights Amendment was an effort to create true gender equality in law on that highest of all levels. Feminists in the 1920s hoped to build on the 19th Amendment, pass what would have been the 20th Amendment, an Equal Rights Amendment. But in the 1920s, there was a backlash against feminism, the conservative, reactionary era of the 1920s. And so Equal Rights Amendment wasn't passed. It was revisited in the late 60s, early 70s in this next moment of feminism, and ultimately introduced through the amendment process, where it has to pass through Congress, state legislatures. In 1972, Congress approved the Equal Rights Amendment and then sent it to the state legislatures for ratification. It was supported by a majority of Americans. Public opinion polls supported the Equal Rights Amendment. Increasingly, women supported this as a necessary effort that would establish, again, on a constitutional amendment, an end to all discrimination based on sex. But as momentum built, and it looked like the Equal Rights Amendment, the long-deferred dream of feminists from the 1920s, would now be realized, here comes the backlash. And the backlash was led by Phyllis Schlafly, who is the center of this recent series on FX. And it's important that the backlash to the Equal Rights Amendment was advanced by a woman. because if it was advanced by a leading conservative man, it would be easy to dismiss him as just another agent of sexism trying to retard and limit true progress. But in this case, the objections to the Equal Rights Amendment were advanced by a woman. Phyllis Schlafly argued, interestingly, that if this was passed, women would, quote, lose their privileges. What were the privileges that she talked about? Well, the privileges that come with being a wife, mother, protection, security. We would be treated as just like men, she said, and that's bad because women deserve to be treated in a privileged way. In their roles as wives and mothers, they need to be protected. The big argument for Schlafly concerned things like the draft. And remember, this is 1972, 1973. The draft is not an abstract concept. It's real. She argued if there was no legal distinction between men and women, women would be drafted. They would fight in the next Vietnam. Also, a big part of her argument concerned, yes, indeed, bathrooms, which seems to always be the battleground of all things regarding gender equality. Schlafly was the first to argue that if we adopt the Equal Rights Amendment, it would end men's rooms and women's room. We'd all have to poop and pee next to each other. Oh, the tragedy of it all, right? She said if the Equal Rights Amendment would passed, we couldn't have separate restrooms for men and women. Of course, that's nonsense, but that was the argument she made. And we know, in regards to today and issues of transgender rights, that people get really worked up about bathrooms. And so she really had an issue that could agitate and get people excited. And as a result, though the Equal Rights Amendment was supported by a majority of Americans, though it passed Congress, it failed to reach the very high threshold necessary for an amendment to the Constitution. Again, amendments are powerful. They're hard to overturn. And the reason why is that they require such a high threshold to pass. Schlafly and other conservatives successfully lobbied state legislatures in a couple key states, and the Equal Rights Amendment failed to be adopted. Now, if you've been following the news recently, it's back. And some of the state legislatures that voted against the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s have recently voted to support it. And so there's an interesting debate going on right now as to whether or not the Equal Rights Amendment will once again be resurrected and maybe now finally have the votes that it failed to achieve in the 1920s, failed to achieve in the 1970s. Again, in a new America, where women are increasingly breadwinners, heads of households, out-earning men, where we have best-selling books like The End of Men, where the majority of bachelor's degrees are awarded to women, there might be an opportunity and context here, where also political allegiances are shifting in some of the states that had previously failed to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. So stay tuned. I don't know. It's hard to imagine that in such a divided America and where there's such a strong and intense backlash to feminism today, we will amend the Constitution, but it's interesting to again think about as we further indicate how the history we learn in this class isn't really history. It's part of our daily lives today. We saw that recently in our look at immigration, how that lecture hopefully helped you understand the America you live in today, more diverse, more pluralistic, and the era of Trump. And also this lecture helps you understand the America we live in today, where the Equal Rights Amendment still is alive and advanced by many. Schlafly always argued that we didn't need an Equal Rights Amendment because the real thing that would free American women was good old capitalism. As a conservative, she was a strong advocate for free market capitalism. She was also a Cold Warrior and criticized Soviet Union. So Schlafly wasn't just the conservative who was opposed to feminism. She was a conservative in all the different elements of that movement. And as a result of that, very condemnatory of communism, very celebratory of capitalism. And she once said that the free enterprise system, capitalism, free markets, private property, that's what's really going to liberate women because capitalism liberates humanity, she argued. Well, I don't think she had in mind the way in which that would ultimately be realized, where, as I've said throughout this lecture, thanks to feminism, thanks to the efforts of Betty Friedan and others, women do have greater opportunities today. Now, again, there's still many, many concerns in regards to equal pay, in regards to a beauty culture and popular culture that still in many ways advances the princess image for young girls and seems to limit ways of imagining women confining them in certain ways. So feminism continues, but there have been great achievements, great advances. And now women are out earning men, excelling in certain enterprises. They're in the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, maybe someday the White House. CEOs of corporations, faculty at prestigious universities. I don't think that's what Schlafly had in mind, though, when she said that capitalism will make women free. Women have, in their pursuit of education and careers, vaulted into these positions of prominence in our capitalist economy. They're out earning men. One of the last things that Phyllis Schlafly wrote, she passed away a couple years ago, she wrote an op-ed published just before her death that urged American women to get out of college campuses, put down their pencils, run out of lecture halls, and get back to the business of marrying and being dedicated to being wives and mothers. Yeah, the reason why Schlafly wrote that was that, well, the genie was out of the bottle. The winds of change were blowing. That women had in the efforts that followed the fall of the Equal Rights Amendment really advanced and embraced those efforts. They did go get a degree. They did pursue a career. Now they are in many ways advancing in the capitalist economy in these ways that I don't think Schlafly would have been too supportive of, particularly considering that last op-ed she penned. Civil rights and citizenship. That's been our focus in these lectures. We've talked about racial minorities, immigration reform, and now feminism. And it's really about shared values, goals, images of remaking America as one in which all individuals are free from the limits imposed upon them based on race, gender, country of origin, religion, to pursue a life of their own making, to be autonomous individuals. That was the goal of feminism, but it did inspire this backlash that thwarted the Equal Rights Amendment among conservatives who have this different image for women, not as free, autonomous individuals, but as a privileged, protected status who will never be drafted, never have to pee in the same bathroom as men, and have a sort of special status as wives and mothers. And that debate in many ways still is inflected in and represented in a feminist movement that marches on.